The rain hammered against the windows of Southwick House like machine gun fire, and General Dwight David Eisenhower stood motionless, watching the storm that threatened to destroy the largest amphibious invasion in human history. It was the 4th of June, 1944, and Operation Overlord hung by a thread thinner than a spider's web. "The weather's not improving, sir," reported Group Captain James Martin Stagg, the chief meteorologist whose words carried the weight of nations. His weathered face bore the strain of a man who knew that millions of lives depended on his forecast. The Scottish meteorologist had been studying Atlantic weather patterns for weeks, and his latest report painted a grim picture of churning seas and howling winds. Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley paced behind Eisenhower, his boots clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. The First Army commander had seen the faces of his men 100, at 50,000 Allied soldiers packed into landing craft and transport ships, seasick and anxious, waiting for the word that would send them across the English Channel into the teeth of German defenses. "Sir, postponing again means we lose the title conditions," Bradley said, his voice tight with controlled tension. "The next favorable window isn't until the 19th. That's 2 more weeks of keeping this secret from German intelligence." Eisenhower turned from the window, his steel blue eyes reflecting the burden of command. At 53, the Kansas farm boy had risen to become Supreme Allied Commander, but nothing in his military career had prepared him for this moment. The decision he made in the next few hours would determine whether democracy survived or fell to the Nazi war machine. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur William Tedder shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The Deputy Supreme Commander had reviewed the air support plans countless times, knowing that without adequate air cover, the invasion would become a slaughter. "The cloud ceiling is too low for effective bombing runs," he reported grimly. "Our heavy bombers won't be able to hit the beach fortifications with any accuracy." Admiral Sir Bertram Home Ramsay, commander of the naval forces, spread his charts across the oak table. His flotilla of 6,939 vessels represented the largest naval armada ever assembled. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and landing craft stretched across the southern English ports like a metallic sea. "The Navy can handle rough seas," Ramsay declared, "but the landing craft will struggle in these conditions. We're looking at significant casualties from drowning before the men even reach the beaches." According to Stephen Ambrose's definitive account in D-Day, June 6, 1944, Eisenhower faced the most crucial decision of the war. During these tense hours at Southwick House, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of all ground forces, remained characteristically confident despite the circumstances. Monty had defeated Rommel in North Africa and knew the German mindset better than most. "The Hun expects us to postpone," he said with clipped precision. "They're comfortable in their bunkers, thinking the weather protects them. This storm might be our greatest advantage." The room fell silent except for the continued assault of rain against glass. Maps covered every surface, showing the 5 invasion beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Red pins marked German strong points, the Atlantic Wall that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months reinforcing, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, and millions of mines waited for the Allied soldiers. Eisenhower picked up a letter from his desk, his pre-written statement accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. The words seemed to burn through the paper. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. At 21:45 hours, Stagg returned with updated weather reports. "Gentlemen," he announced, "there's a break coming. The storm will ease tomorrow night, giving us a window of opportunity on the 6th. Eisenhower stood silent for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. The weight of history pressed down on his shoulders as he considered the alternatives. Delay meant risking exposure of the invasion plans. Attack meant sending men into uncertain conditions against fortified positions. Finally, he spoke the words that would echo through history. "Okay, let's go." At 0300 hours on the 6th of June, 1944, the largest armada in history cut through the pre-dawn darkness of the English Channel. The storm that had threatened to cancel Operation Overlord had indeed abated, leaving choppy seas under clearing skies. Aboard thousands of landing craft, Allied soldiers huddled together, many praying, others writing what they believed might be their final letters home. Private First Class Robert Arthur Art Peterson of the 29th Infantry Division pressed his back against the cold steel of landing craft, vehicle. Personnel number 1212. The 19-year-old farm boy from Nebraska had never seen an ocean before joining the Army, and now the channel's gray-green waves seemed determined to empty his stomach of the breakfast he'd barely been able to choke down. "You all right there, farm boy?" asked Sergeant Michael Patrick O'Brien, a grizzled veteran of the North African campaign. The 32-year-old Irishman from Boston had seen combat before, but even he felt the knots of tension in his gut. This was different, bigger than anything attempted in military history. Nearby, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder prepared his Rangers for their suicide mission at Point du Hoc. The 2nd Ranger Battalion's objective seemed impossible. Scale 100-foot cliffs under enemy fire to destroy German artillery positions. Rudder, a former Texas high school football coach, looked at his 225 men and saw determination mixed with fear. The naval bombardment began at 0550 hours with a thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Battleships USS Texas, USS Arkansas, HMS Warspite, and HMS Ramillies opened fire with their massive guns, hurling shells the size of small automobiles at German positions. The pre-dawn sky lit up like the 4th of July as hundreds of naval guns joined the barrage. Admiral Alan Goodrich Kirk, commanding the Western Naval Task Force, watched from the bridge of USS Augusta as his ships pounded the Norman coast. The 56-year-old naval officer had coordinated the naval aspects of the invasion with meticulous precision, but he knew that no plan survived first contact with the enemy. Above the Armada, the roar of aircraft engines filled the air. Over 13,000 alive planes had taken to the skies, the largest air operation in history. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Blakesley led his 4th Fighter Group Mustangs in sweeps over the beaches, searching for Luftwaffe fighters that stubbornly refused to appear in significant numbers. Captain Frank Lillyman and his Pathfinders of the 101st Airborne Division had already been on the ground for hours, dropped behind enemy lines in the early morning darkness. Their mission was to mark drop zones and rally points for the main airborne assault. Lillyman, crouched in a Norman hedgerow with his small team, could hear the approaching drone of transport aircraft carrying 18,000 paratroopers and glider troops. Cornelius Ryan's comprehensive research in the longest day reveals that German defenders initially believed that airborne drops were merely diversionary raids, rather than the prelude to the main invasion. At German 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, General Friedrich Dahlmann struggled to assess the situation. Reports flooded in of airborne landings, naval bombardments, and approaching landing craft, but the German command structure remained confused about Allied intentions. Field Marshal Rommel had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday, confident that the weather would prevent any invasion attempt. Major Werner Pluskett peered through his binoculars from his bunker at Omaha Beach, scarcely believing what he saw. The horizon was black with ships, more vessels than he had ever imagined could exist. His hands trembled as he reached for his telephone to report the sighting to regimental headquarters. "Sir, there must be 10,000 ships out there," Pluskett reported, his voice betraying his shock. "The Americans and British together don't have 10,000 ships," came the skeptical reply from his superior. "For God's sake, come and see for yourself," Pluskett pleaded, knowing that his words seemed impossible even to him. At 0630 hours, the first landing craft approached the beaches. HR had arrived at Utah Beach. The 4th Infantry Division under Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, prepared to be the first Americans to set foot on Nazi-occupied Europe. The 56-year-old general had insisted on leading the assault personally. Despite his age and poor health, the naval bombardment lifted, and an eerie silence fell over the Norman coast. In that moment of quiet before the storm, thousands of young men prepared to charge into the unknown. Some would become heroes. Others would never see another sunset. But all would become part of the greatest military operation in human history. The landing craft engines roared to life, propelling the small boats toward their destiny on the beaches of Normandy. The bow ramp of landing craft, vehicle, personnel 1,212 crashed down into the surf at 0645 hours, and Private First Class Robert Peterson stepped into hell. The icy water of the English Channel rose to his chest as machine gun bullets from German MG-42s whistled overhead like angry hornets. Omaha Beach stretched before him, a crescent of sand that would soon be stained red with Allied blood. "Move, move, move," screamed Sergeant O'Brien, pushing his men forward through the churning surf. The landing had gone catastrophically wrong from the first moment. The preliminary bombing had missed its targets, the naval bombardment had been too brief, and the Germans of the 352nd Infantry Division were very much alive and fighting. To Peterson's left, a soldier from the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, suddenly pitched forward into the waves, his helmet spinning away as a sniper's bullet found its mark. The farm boy from Nebraska had never seen death before, and the casual suddenness of it nearly froze him in place. Only O'Brien's iron grip on his equipment pulled him forward toward the seawall. The beach was a nightmare of obstacles and death. Rommel's asparagus wooden stakes, topped with mines jutted from the sand like grotesque sculptures. Czech hedgehogs made of steel beams formed geometric patterns, designed to rip the bottoms from landing craft. Concertina wire stretched in deadly ribbons, and every square meter seemed to be covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Colonel George Arthur Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment found himself pinned down behind a disabled Sherman tank, watching his men die in the surf. The landings at Dog Green sector had become a slaughter. Companies A, B, and C of the 116th Infantry Regiment had ceased to exist as fighting units. Their men scattered across the sand like broken dolls. "The kinds of people are staying on this beach," Taylor shouted over the din of battle. "The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Above the chaos on Omaha, Captain Frank Draper of the 5th Ranger Battalion watched through binoculars as his men attempted to scale the cliffs at Point Du Hoc. Lieutenant Colonel Rutter's Rangers had landed 40 minutes late and at the wrong location, but they pressed on with their mission, rocket-fired grappling. Hooks sailed upward, carrying rope ladders and climbing ropes. German defenders rolled grenades down the cliff face and cut the ropes as fast as the Rangers could fire new ones. Staff Sergeant William Bill Petty reached the top of Point Du Hoc after a harrowing climb, only to discover that the massive German guns they had come to destroy were fake telephone poles painted to look like artillery pieces. From aerial reconnaissance, the real guns had been moved inland, but Petty and his Rangers would spend the day fighting for their lives on the cliff top, cut off and surrounded. According to war correspondent Ernie Powell's dispatches, the courage displayed by individual soldiers at Omaha Beach represented the ultimate test of American democracy under fire. At Utah Beach, the situation was dramatically different. The 4th Infantry Division had landed 1 mile south of their intended target, but Brigadier General Roosevelt quickly assessed the situation and made a command decision. "That saved thousands of lives. We'll start the war from right here," he declared, redirecting the entire assault to take advantage of latter German defenses. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 101st Airborne Division found himself leading an impromptu assault on a German strongpoint near the village of Messiers. Armed only with a Thompson submachine gun and unstoppable determination, Summers single-handedly cleared for buildings filled with German soldiers, killing dozens of enemy troops in fierce close-quarters combat. Meanwhile, Major John Howard and his glider troops of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry had achieved one of the war's most daring coups. Landing in darkness near the Caen Canal, Howard's men captured Pegasus Bridge in a lightning assault that lasted mere minutes. The bridge was vital to prevent German armor from counterattacking the British landing beaches. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division faced their own trial by fire. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Cecil Ingersoll Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment had won the Victoria Cross at Dieppe in 1942, and now he watched Canadian soldiers prove their worth on Norman sand. The Canadians advanced farther inland on D-Day than any other Allied unit, their maple leaf flags marking the deepest penetration into German-held territory. On Gold Beach, Sergeant Major Stanley Elton Hollis of the Green Howards became the only man to win the Victoria Cross. On D-Day itself, armed with a Sten gun, Hollis single-handedly assaulted the German pillbox, killed the crew, and then repeated the performance at a second position. His actions opened a gap in German defenses that allowed British forces to advance inland. As the morning wore on, individual acts of heroism began to tip the balance. Medics ran into machine gun fire to treat wounded comrades. Engineers blew gaps in beach obstacles under heavy fire. Officers and non-commissioned officers led by example, showing their men that the seemingly impossible could be achieved through courage and determination. By noon, the issue remained in doubt, but the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted fortress Europe, had been breached in 5 places. The cost was staggering, but the foothold had been gained. As the sun reached its zenith over Normandy on the 6th of June, The battle for Europe's liberation hung in the balance. At Omaha Beach, Private First Class Peterson crouched behind a concrete seawall, his uniform soaked with seawater and blood, some his own, some belonging to comrades who would never see home again. The Nebraska farm boy had aged years in the span of hours, his boyish face now etched with the 1,000-yard stare of combat. Sergeant O'Brien lay 20 yards away. A German machine gun burst, having caught him across the chest as he rallied his squad for another assault up the bluffs. With his dying breath, the Boston Irishman had passed command to Peterson with words that would haunt the young soldier forever. "Get them home, farm boy. Get them all home." The breakthrough at Omaha came not from grand strategy, but from the accumulated courage of individual soldiers. Captain Joe Dawson of Company G, 16th Infantry Regiment, led 37 men up a narrow draw between WII-70 and WII-72 German strongpoints that had been designated as impregnable, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast through wire obstacles and grenades to clear machine gun nests. Dawson's small force opened the first significant gap in the German defenses. Simultaneously, Colonel Charles David Wharton Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment, wounded in the hand by shrapnel, gathered scattered elements of his shattered regiment. Despite his injury and the chaos surrounding him, Canham organized a coordinated assault that finally cracked the German defensive line. "They're murdering us here," Canham radioed to the command ship. "Let's move inland and get murdered." His dark humor masked the tactical brilliance of his decision. Rather than continue the futile assault straight up the heavily defended beach exits, Canham's men infiltrated through gaps in the German lines, attacking strong points from behind and creating confusion among the defenders. At Point du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel Rutter's Rangers continued their desperate fight on the cliff top. Of the 225 men who had begun the assault, only 90 remained effective. German counterattacks came in waves, supported by artillery fire from inland positions. Rutter himself had been wounded twice, but refused evacuation. First Sergeant Leonard Bud Lomel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn made the discovery that justified the entire operation. Moving inland from the captured German positions, they found the real enemy guns hidden in an apple orchard, camouflaged and ready to fire on the invasion fleet. Using thermite grenades, the two Rangers destroyed the artillery pieces that could have devastated the landings. General Omar Bradley's memoir A Soldier's Story describes the Point du Hoc assault as the most dangerous mission of D-Day, requiring Rangers to accomplish what many considered impossible on the British and Canadian beaches. Progress had been more encouraging but equally costly at Sword Beach. Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service Brigade had landed to the sound of bagpipes played by Piper William Millen. The Scottish Commando's music provided a surreal soundtrack to the carnage, and somehow he survived the entire day without a scratch despite German snipers targeting him specifically. Major Peter Young of No. 3 Commando led his men through the streets of Ouistreham, fighting house-to-house battles against German paratroopers of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Parachute Regiment. The German paratroopers were among Hitler's elite units, and they sold their lives dearly in brutal close-quarters combat. At Gold Beach, the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division faced the German 716th Infantry Regiment in a series of deadly engagements. Company Sergeant Major Henry Harry Robinson of the East Yorkshire Regiment found himself leading a company when all the officers became casualties. The coal miner from Durham rallied his men with words that became legend. "Come on, lads, we didn't come this far to let Jerry turn us back now." The airborne operations behind enemy lines had achieved mixed results. Major General Matthew Bunker Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division had been scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, with many paratroopers landing miles from their intended drop zones. However, this unintended dispersal created confusion among German defenders, who received reports of airborne landings from dozens of locations. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself hanging from the church steeple in St. Mary Église. His parachute caught on the tower. For hours, he played dead while German soldiers controlled the town square below. When American paratroopers finally liberated the village, Steele had witnessed the entire battle from his unique vantage point. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Harrison Vandervoort of the 2nd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had broken his ankle on landing but refused medical attention. Leading his men with a makeshift crutch, Vandervoort directed the defense of St. Mary Église against German counterattacks. Throughout the day, by 1500 hours, The immediate crisis had passed on most beaches. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, but at a terrible cost. Provisional casualty reports suggested over 4,000 Allied dead and wounded, with some units suffering casualties approaching 75%. Yet the foothold had been established, and reinforcements continued to pour ashore. General Eisenhower received the first reports at his headquarters in Portsmouth. The Supreme Allied commander had spent the day pacing, smoking cigarettes, and waiting for word from Normandy. When the message arrived confirming the successful establishment of beachheads, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction before turning to the monumental task of expanding the invasion. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Norman sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to reflect the blood spilled on the beaches below. As twilight approached on the 6th of June, 1944, the character of the battle began to shift from desperate assault to grim consolidation. The immediate question was no longer whether the invasion would succeed, but whether the Allies could hold their precarious footholds against the inevitable German counterattack. Along the Norman coast, exhausted soldiers dug foxholes in the sand and prepared for what promised to be a sleepless night. Private First Class Peterson, now acting squad leader following Sergeant O'Brien's death, helped establish a defensive perimeter to 100 yards inland from Omaha Beach. The teenager, who had never been farther than the county seat before the war, now found himself responsible for 8 men, most older than himself. The weight of command sat heavily on his young shoulders as he distributed ammunition and checked fields of fire. "Think they'll counterattack tonight?" asked Private Danny Kowalski, a Polish American kid from Chicago whose hands still shook from the morning's trauma. Peterson looked toward the darkening inland horizon, where German artillery continued to flash like heat lightning. "Count on it," he replied with newfound authority. "Jerry's had all day to figure out what hit him. He'll come back hard." At German 7th Army headquarters, the confusion that had characterized the morning gradually gave way to organized response. General Dahlman finally grasped the scope of the Allied operation and began moving reserves toward Normandy. However, precious hours had been lost due to command paralysis and Hitler's insistence that no major movements occur without his personal approval. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division had been requesting permission to attack since dawn. As the only armored reserve near the landing beaches, his panzers could have potentially driven the British back into the sea. But standing orders required authorization from Army Group B headquarters, where Field Marshal Rommel remained absent, and his staff dithered over the magnitude of Allied deception operations. According to historian John Keegan's analysis in 6 Armies in Normandy, the German command's delayed response to D-Day represented one of the war's most crucial strategic failures. At Point du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's remaining Rangers prepared for what they expected to be their final stand. German forces had surrounded the position completely, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Rudder radioed his last situation report to the 2nd Ranger Battalion command post, located Point du Hoc. Mission accomplished. Need ammunition and reinforcements. Many casualties. Staff Sergeant Petty organized the defense of the southern perimeter, where German infantry probed for weaknesses in the Ranger positions. The former New York City policeman had collected weapons from fallen comrades and now carried the Thompson submachine guns, a pistol, and a bag full of grenades. His calm under fire steadied the younger Rangers who looked to him for leadership. Meanwhile, the airborne divisions behind enemy lines faced their own challenges. As German reserve units finally began coordinated counterattacks at St. Mireilles, Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort's paratroopers repelled 3 separate German assaults during the afternoon, but each attack grew stronger as enemy reinforcements arrived. Major General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne Division, established his command post in a Norman farmhouse and attempted to coordinate his scattered units. Radio communications remained spotty, and many of his paratroopers were still unaccounted for. However, reports filtering in suggested that despite the chaos, his division was accomplishing its mission of securing the flanks of the invasion. Captain Richard Dick Winters of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, led one of the day's most successful small unit actions. With just 13 men, Winters assaulted a German artillery battery at Brecourt Manor that had been firing on Utah Beach. Using tactics learned in training, his tiny force destroyed 4 German guns and killed or captured 50 enemy soldiers, without losing a single man. On the beaches themselves, The massive logistical effort of supporting the invasion continued despite ongoing German artillery fire. Beach masters organized the flow of men and supplies with the precision of traffic policemen, while engineers cleared obstacles and established roads leading inland. The artificial harbors codenamed Mulberry had not yet arrived, but advanced elements were already surveying sites for their installation. Captain Joseph Theodore Dawson, the hero of the morning breakthrough at Omaha, found his company ordered to advance toward the village of Colville-sur-Mer. The assault up the bluffs had cost him 28 of his original 194 men, but the survivors pressed forward with grim determination. Each farmhouse became a potential fortress, each hedgerow a defensive position. As darkness fell, the sounds of battle gradually diminished, but never ceased entirely. Sniper fire cracked sporadically across the Norman countryside, and the distant rumble of artillery provided a constant background to the night. Allied soldiers learned to distinguish between incoming and outgoing rounds of skill that would serve them well in the months ahead. At sea, the Great Armada continued its work. Hospital ships received the wounded, their white hulls clearly marked with red crosses, but still vulnerable to German air attack. Transport vessels unloaded fresh troops who would join the battle at first light, while warships maintained their protective screen against U-boat attacks that never materialized in significant numbers. By midnight, preliminary casualty reports reached Allied headquarters. The numbers were staggering: over 10,000 Allied casualties across all beaches and airborne operations, yet the Atlantic Wall had been irreparably breached. At 156,000 Allied soldiers now stood on French soil. The liberation of Europe had begun in earnest. In London, Prime Minister Winston Spencer Churchill prepared to address Parliament about the day's events. The old lion had worried through the night and day, knowing that failure in Normandy would mean the postponement of victory by years, if not decades. The 7th of June dawned gray and overcast, with a steady drizzle that turned Norman soil into glutinous mud. The immediate crisis of D-Day had passed, but the Germans were far from finished. Field Marshal Rommel had returned from Germany during the night, his staff car racing through darkened French countryside as he assessed the catastrophe that had befallen his Atlantic Wall. How could this have happened? Rommel demanded of his staff officers at La Roche-Guyon Castle, the Desert Fox, who had earned his reputation fighting British forces in North Africa, now faced the consequences of Germany's strategic miscalculations. We had every advantage: fortified positions, interior lines, local superiority. How did we allow them to establish themselves? General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, spread reconnaissance photographs across the map table. The images revealed the scope of Allied deception. Dummy landing craft had convinced German intelligence that the main assault would come at Pas de Calais, while the real invasion struck at the weakest point in their defenses. Private First Class Peterson and his makeshift squad spent their second day in Normandy expanding the Omaha beachhead. The farm boy from Nebraska had become a combat veteran overnight, his movements now economical and purposeful. He no longer flinched at artillery explosions or automatic weapons fire. His body had adapted to the rhythms of warfare with frightening speed. Peterson, take your squad and clear that farmhouse, ordered Lieutenant James Madison Patterson, a replacement officer fresh from officer candidate school at Fort Benning. The 22-year-old from Alabama had arrived on the evening of D-Day and was struggling to adapt to combat realities. "Sir, the house has been quiet all morning," Peterson replied respectfully. "Could be empty. Could be a trap. Recommend we observe it for another hour before moving." Patterson bristled at having his orders questioned by an enlisted man, but the other non-commissioned officers supported Peterson's assessment. Combat had a way of revealing natural leadership, regardless of rank or formal military education. At Point du Hoc, relief finally arrived for Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's battered Rangers. Elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion fought their way up the coastal road, breaking through German positions that had surrounded the point for 36 hours. Of the original 225 Rangers who had made the assault, only 40 to remain effective for duty. Staff Sergeant Petty embraced his relief with tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. The former New York policeman had held his section of the perimeter through 3 major German counterattacks, expending every round of ammunition and resorting to hand-to-hand combat with entrenching tools and bayonets. "I never thought I'd see another sunrise," Petty confessed to his replacement. "Those kids fought like lions, every damn one of them." Stephen Ambrose's interviews with D-Day veterans compiled in Citizen Soldiers, reveal that the first week after the landings tested, Allied resolve more severely than the invasion itself. The British and Canadian sectors had consolidated more successfully, with armored units finally getting ashore in significant numbers. The Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, a territorial cavalry unit converted to tanks, engaged German panzers in the first major armored clash of the campaign. Lieutenant Stuart Hamilton Hills, commanding a Sherman Firefly tank, destroyed the German panzer. Mark IVs in a running battle near Villers-Bocage, however. German resistance was stiffening as reserve units reached the front. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, composed of fanatical 18 and 19-year-old volunteers, launched savage counterattacks against Canadian positions. These young Germans fought with suicidal determination, viewing the invasion as a personal affront to their National Socialist beliefs. Captain Sidney Valpy Radley Walters of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers found himself fighting battles that resembled medieval sieges more than modern warfare. Each Norman village became a fortress, with German machine gun teams positioned in church towers and anti-tank guns hidden behind stone walls. The Bocage country ancient Norman hedgerows that compartmentalized the landscape favored defenders and turned every field into a potential killing ground. Major General Erwin Rommel made his first visit to the front lines on the 7th, surveying the damage to his carefully constructed defenses. The field marshal, who had earned Hitler's confidence through audacious victories in France and North Africa, now faced the daunting task of containing an enemy who enjoyed complete air superiority and unlimited naval support. "We must throw them back into the sea within 48 hours, Rommel told his divisional commanders. "Every hour they remain ashore makes them stronger, while we grow weaker." The Wehrmacht's fate hangs in the balance here in Normandy, but German counterattacks lacked coordination and suffered from critical shortages. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could manage only 300 sorties against the invasion fleet, pathetic compared to the 15,000 Allied flights on D-Day alone. German pilots, many of them teenagers with minimal training, flew obsolete aircraft against experienced Allied aces in superior machines. Major Johannes Steinhoff of Jagdgeschwader 7 led one of the few effective German air attacks. His Messerschmitt Bf 100 and 9 fighters strafing Allied positions near Caen. However, his squadron lost 6 aircraft to Allied fighters without inflicting significant damage on ground targets. By the end of the 7th of June, Allied forces had linked most of their beachheads into a continuous front 30 miles wide and varying from 3 to 10 miles deep. 326,000 men had landed, along with 54,000 vehicles and over 100,000 tons of supplies. The invasion had achieved irreversible momentum, yet the price continued to mount. Field hospitals behind the beaches overflowed with casualties, and burial details worked around the clock to inter the dead with dignity. The liberation of Europe was proving as costly as its conquest had been. Swift in his private moments, General Eisenhower contemplated the magnitude of what had been accomplished and what lay ahead. The hardest fighting was yet to come. 1 week after D-Day, the Norman Bocage had become a sprawling battlefield where individual soldiers learned that survival depended more on cunning than courage. Private First Class Peterson, now wearing sergeant's stripes hastily sewn onto his field jacket, led his squad through the maze of ancient hedgerows that compartmentalized the countryside into natural fortresses. The Nebraska farm boy had been promoted after Lieutenant Patterson stepped on a German mine, while ignoring Peterson's advice about cleared paths. "Remember what I taught you about the hedgerows," Peterson whispered to Private Kowalski as they approached another field boundary. "Jerry likes to put his machine gun at the base of the hedgerow, not on top. He'll let you get halfway across the field before he opens up." The young soldier from Chicago nodded nervously, his hands white-knuckled on his M1 Garand rifle. Like Peterson, Kowalski had aged years and days, but he still jumped at the sound of German Nebelwerfer rockets, the screaming memes, whose psychological effect often exceeded their destructive power. 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach, the village of St. Lawrence-sur-Mer had become a typical example of Norman warfare. Every stone building sheltered German snipers or machine gun teams, while American infantry moved from house to house in deadly games of hide and seek. Staff Sergeant William Earl Bill Davis of the 2nd Infantry Division had perfected the art of urban combat, using satchel charges and flamethrowers to clear buildings systematically. "Warring like the movies," Davis explained to a replacement lieutenant fresh from the States. "You don't charge across open ground yelling battle cries. You stay low, Move slow, and think before you shoot. The Jerry who kills you is the one you don't see coming. At German 7th Army headquarters, General Dahlmann faced the growing realization that the Atlantic Wall, 3 years in construction, and billions of marks in cost, had failed catastrophically. Field Marshal Rommel's visit on the 8th of June had been devastating in its frank assessment. The German army in Normandy was fighting a losing battle against impossible odds. "We need for panzer divisions immediately," Rommel had demanded. "Every day we delay gives the Allies time to build up their strength. We're fighting the clock as much as the enemy." But Hitler's reserves remained committed to defending Pas-de-Calais against a second invasion that existed only in Allied deception. Plans, the Führer's intuition, which had served Germany well in the early war years, now became a strategic liability. His insistence on personal control over major troop movements meant that precious hours turned into days while German forces remained paralyzed by indecision. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division finally received permission to attack on the afternoon of the 8th of June, but by then Allied anti-tank guns and fighter bombers had turned the Norman countryside into a killing field for German armor. His panzers, which might have driven the British back into the sea on D-Day, now faced an enemy that had consolidated defensive positions and called in devastating naval gunfire support. According to Max Hastings' authoritative account Overlord, D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, German tactical excellence could not overcome strategic blunders and material disadvantage. That grew worse each day. The human cost of establishing the Norman beachhead became starkly apparent as casualty reports reached Allied headquarters. Over 20,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or reported missing in the first week of operations. American cemeteries were being established near Omaha and Utah beaches, their white crosses forming geometric patterns that would become heartbreakingly familiar sights across Europe. Captain Joseph Dawson, the hero of the Omaha breakthrough, found himself commanding a composite battalion formed from the remnants of 3 shattered companies. The professional soldier from Texas had learned to write letters to the families of dead soldiers, a skill never taught at West Point, but essential for any officer who survived more than a few weeks of combat. "I regret to inform you that your son died courageously while serving his country," Dawson wrote to Mrs. Catherine O'Brien of Boston, describing her son Michael's final moments without mentioning the screaming and chaos that had characterized the sergeant's death. These letters would haunt Dawson for the rest of his life, each one a reminder of the price paid for European liberation. At Point du Hoc, now secured and being used as an artillery observation post, Staff Sergeant Petty supervised the burial of German defenders who had fought to the death rather than surrender. The former New York policeman had developed a grudging respect for enemy soldiers who showed the same courage under fire that he expected from his own men. "They're just kids. Most of them," Petty observed to a war correspondent, 17, 18 years old, "could be my own sons if things were different. But they fought like demons, and they died like soldiers. Got to respect that, even if they were fighting for the wrong side." The airborne divisions, scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, had finally achieved their primary objectives despite horrific casualties. Major General Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division controlled key road junctions and bridges, while Major General Maxwell Taylor's 101st Airborne had secured the western flank of the invasion. However, both divisions had suffered over 30% casualties and desperately needed reinforcement and resupply. Captain Richard Winters, now commanding Easy Company after his previous commander became a casualty, established defensive positions around the town of Carentan. The natural leader from Pennsylvania had emerged as one of the airborne's most effective company commanders, combining tactical brilliance with genuine concern for his men's welfare. "We've done what they asked us to do," Winters told his assembled platoon leaders. "Now we hold what we've gained and prepare for the next phase. Remember, every German soldier we kill here is one less defending Berlin. We're going to end this war, but it's going to cost us." By the 14th of June, 1 week after D-Day, the Allied beachhead extended 50 miles along the Norman coast and penetrated up to 20 miles inland. Over 500,000 Allied soldiers had crossed the English Channel, supported by thousands of vehicles and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. The Mulberry artificial harbors were operational, allowing larger vessels to discharge cargo directly onto the beaches. General Omar Bradley established his first Army headquarters in a Norman apple orchard, from where he coordinated operations across the American sector. The Missouri schoolteacher turned general had proven himself one of America's most capable field commanders, but he understood that the hardest fighting lay ahead. The German army, though bloodied, remained dangerous and would contest every mile of French soil. Field Marshal Rommel made his final assessment of German prospects. In a brutally honest report to Hitler dated the 15th of June, the enemy has succeeded in landing a large-scale invasion force and is continuously strengthening his beachhead. Our own reserves are insufficient to contain him, much less drive him back into the sea. Unless we receive significant reinforcements within days, the battle for Normandy will be lost. Hitler's response came swiftly. Rommel was ordered to hold his positions at all costs, with no mention of additional troops or equipment. The Desert Fox realized that he was being asked to perform miracles, with inadequate resources against an enemy that grew stronger every hour. Private First Class Peterson, now a combat veteran despite his 19 years, wrote his first letter, home since D-Day, sitting in a muddy foxhole near the village of Isigny. He struggled to find words that would reassure his parents, while conveying something of what he had experienced. Dear Mom and Dad, I am well and doing my duty. We have given the Germans a good licking here in France, and the boys are in fine spirits. Don't worry about me. I have learned to take care of myself, and I am fighting alongside the finest soldiers in the world. Give my love to Sarah and tell her I will bring her something pretty from Paris. Your loving son, Robert. He did not mention Sergeant O'Brien's death, or the screaming of wounded men on Omaha Beach, or the nightmares that woke him every few hours. Some truths were too heavy to share with civilians, no matter how much he loved them. As the sun set, on the 14th of June, 1944, the Norman countryside settled into an uneasy quiet broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. The great invasion had succeeded, but the liberation of Europe had only just begun. Ahead lay months of brutal fighting through the Bocage, the breakout from the beachhead, the race across France, and ultimately the final assault on Hitler's Reich. The men who had stormed the beaches of Normandy had proven that free peoples could match the military prowess of totalitarian states. They had paid a terrible price for that victory, measured in graves that stretched across Norman hillsides. But they had opened the second front that Churchill and Stalin had demanded, and they had begun the final chapter of the European war. In years to come, when old men gathered to remember their youth, they would speak of the 6th of June, 1944, as the day when ordinary citizens became heroes, when democracy proved its strength against tyranny, and when the tide of war turned irrevocably toward justice. They had been present at the creation of a new world, though the full price of that creation would not be known until the last shot was fired and the last grave was dug. The longest day had ended, but its consequences would echo through history forever.